Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 20th September 2023. I'm doing this, well, I would do this video anyway, but normally I'd have a segment in my news update, my second one of the day. I might move that back out. I never used to put that in. I just started giving a teaser, but then I end up talking too much about it. It takes up quite a lot of that second news video, so I might just drop that and just do a whole separate Frontline, which I do anyway, as a separate video. So it gives me a little bit more time to cover some of those big topics that sometimes pop up, like today in the second news video. Right, and talking about news, this happened just after I finished my recordings, but it's worth mentioning heavy explosions in Crimea, presumably somewhere near the Abel military airport. The Russian occupation claims that drones were intercepted and that only grass is burning, but this looks not very likely, and especially when you see actual footage, and this is the second one in as many days, of Storm Shadow missiles flying over Crimea.
Ракеты пошли.
Storm Shadow. My best impression of a Ukrainian or Russian doing English. So that is significant, and I think Crimea is just getting a little bit battered on a daily basis from all sorts of different ordnance. Now, I mentioned that a plane was hitting Crimea. I forgot to also rant about how, this might surprise you, how there aren't cope cages around planes. I said the other day, when you saw those cope cages around some Su bombers or whatever they were, Su fighter bombers in Russia, and there's some footage. Yes, there's footage of the big bombers having tires placed on top of them and on their wings, and on some of the smaller airframes as well. You might laugh at that kind of stuff, but I don't. I think that anything that can even slightly mitigate aerial threats is going to be worth doing. And the problem of putting them in hangars is you can blow out the hangars, and they can, I don't know if that's as good an option as putting things around a plane to protect them from, particularly from drones, right? Now, the reason why cope cages were laughed about, and I took the mickey out of them, is because they're being placed on tanks to stop. Well, they're basically designed to stop RPGs, so they're putting them on the tanks to try and stop them from javelins. And of course, that was laughable. They're never going to do that, and indeed they didn't. And so you got all these ridiculous-looking cope cages when there weren't these threats of drones at that point in the war. As the war developed, drones became more and more prevalent and more of a threat. And so actually those cope cages or things similar to that started actually having some functional use, whereas it didn't before. And now when you get to this stage in the war, it amazes me that they had planes just sitting out in the open, the Ukrainians. And I would be pretty furious. I think they got away with it because that the drone just missed the plane, probably gave it some minor damage. But you put a cope cage on that, and that's hitting the cope cage. Bits might fly off and hit the airframe as well. But I just think that's got to be worth doing. Anyway, back to the front line. Sorry, it's a bit of a sidetrack there, but I forgot to get angry about that earlier. Right, we go to the northeast sector. The Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs reported that a Russian airstrike destroyed the bridge across the Oskil River in Kupiansk, likely in an effort to hinder Ukrainian supply efforts across the river. Ukrainian forces maintain control of a number of other bridges across the Oskil, however. So that's the ISW, and then actually this is mentioned in Rebar's update. So Rebar's a pro-Russian source saying, in the Kupiansk section, Russian forces resumed attacks on Ukrainian positions in Batkivka and in nearby landings. At the same time, airstrikes disabled the crossing near Kupiansk, which was used by the Ukrainians to transfer forces. just to let you know what the lines mean on my map. Please pause the video if you've not seen my map before. Otherwise, I'm going to get on and tell you that, yeah, up in Kupiansk, there have been some aviation strikes that have caused quite a lot of damage here. I'm not exactly sure what bridge has been hit, but as you can see, there are a number of bridges across the Oskil in this area. If it's this main bridge here, that could be a bit of an issue, certainly. And I mentioned this morning how Russian aviation really is still an issue for the Ukrainians. That they're using these FAB 500 bombs, guided bombs that can glide under the sort of GPS guidance for quite a long way. I mean, if we do, where's Kupiansk there? You can pretty much release that. I think 70 kilometers is what I've heard. So you can have airframes flying around in that kind of area, which is going to be relatively safe in terms of air defenses, and hit Kupiansk. You could bring that forward and hit targets even deeper into Ukrainian territory. So these are definitely a challenge for the Ukrainians. Right, we're going to come down the northeastern axis to the Svatova area, where there is some movement here, as according to... Oh, in fact, no, let's go a little bit further north, Kuzmivka. Just looking on Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, and although they speak quite slowly on that, so I have to watch it when it's not live at 2 times speed, and that podcast, you know, hurries along just nicely. Thank you. So Kuzmivka is this settlement slightly downhill from Novoselivska, a small village, and it turns out the Ukrainians have pushed their way back into the village. It appears there were some Russian strikes, but also Ukrainian strikes. So I think even this top area is thoroughly contested. I think there'll be Ukrainians and Russians there. There are no buildings left, really. It's fairly flat in Novoselivska. It has been for a long time. Nobody lives there. But they were talking about how in the tree line here and the tree line here, there are, you know, trenches, dugouts and whatnot. So this is really difficult now for the Ukrainians to get back across there. And indeed, there appears to be a trench line between these two roads going the length of the village there. So you can argue that the Russians have 3 lines of defense before you even get back to Kuzmivka. Now, there was a long time that Ukrainians were this side of the railway and were even in Kuzmivka and challenging the Russians there, but then they slowly got pushed back, and then they seem to have lost that foothold completely relatively quickly during what was probably a Russian counterattack there. So anyway, that's the situation there. We come down to this area around Ryhorodka. There's a small village of Nadia that I guess Suriyat Mats, being a pro-Russian mapper, is saying, you know, what they end up catching up with reality is really what happens. So this is a claim here. Situation on the Luhansk front. A recent bombardment of Russian army to Ukrainian positions in the forest adjacent to Datchet confirms that the small village was finally recovered by the Ukrainian army. Or either was never taken by the Russians or had been retaken a long time ago. So as you can see from Andrew Perpetua's mapping here, he has a very different interpretation of Russian lines. And I think what happens is when video evidence comes out that's incontestable, then Suriyat has to admit that the Russians aren't there and then moves the lines accordingly. I mean, a good thing, this is why, I mean, I love having both mappers on my map, right? Because actually there's sometimes that like I've explained before, I said again for new watchers and whatnot, Suriyat maps will generally take things off the Russian M&D, but also look at video evidence and say, okay, this has happened today, right, I'm going to move my lines. Sometimes Andrew Perpetua might be a day or so behind that because he looks at a lot at... He doesn't just look at that, though. He looks at all the video evidence and pictorial evidence, but he also has contacts as well. But he does concentrate a lot on shelling evidence. So this is Sentinel imagery, satellite imagery that shows where there is heavy shelling, and he will say, "Well, look, there's heavy shelling around here." Right, which is not something that Suriyat Maps is looking at. So Andrew Perpetua looks at them, you know, as soon as the satellite imagery comes out, he's poring over every meter of the front line. Goodness knows how long it takes him to do this. And he says, right, there's lots of shelling around. I'm using this as an example. Lots of shelling around here. So this is moderate shelling. If this would be Ukrainian line, it would be really heavy shelling because the Russians just absolutely leather, as he said, shellacks certain areas. So it's moderate shelling. This is Ukrainian shelling of Russian positions. And he says, so the Russians are here. Whereas that's not what Suriyat Maps looks at. So Suriyat Maps has to then wait until there's some kind of video evidence rather than satellite evidence to suggest that actually there is a bombardment going on here, or that Ukrainian troops are definitely here, before he adjusts his lines. So I think Andrew Perpetua is much more likely to be more accurate, although there can be a delay because sometimes satellite imagery can't be seen because of cloud cover, or it just takes time for that satellite imagery to come out. Anyway, I just thought I'd shed some light on that. As for the rest of that axis, not a lot going on. Well, there is things going on, right? Because, contested areas and repelled attacks around here, there, and everywhere. Crimea, Torska, so on and so forth. And then coming down to Sperna as well. So as we come down past here, we come to Sperna, where there's quite a bit of activity, I think, going on. I think there's been some strikes as well on Verkhnokamianska recently, and Andrew Perpetua spent some time talking about Bilohorivka and about the topography of that. I've gone through that with you myself previously on a number of occasions. Unfortunately, I can't accentuate the topography of my map here. He can on his, but it is an interesting place. I mean, you can see that it is in this low area here. Got that the town there that's absolutely flat, and in fact, you can see that. I hadn't noticed that. Right, so Bilohorivka is now part of the updated Google Maps. The Google satellite imagery has updated from their 2018 imagery at a number of places along the front line, not everywhere at the moment, and this is one that they have updated because you can see that all the buildings are completely destroyed. Bilohorivka is utterly destroyed. And so when there are Ukrainian troops there, there are Ukrainian troops there, they have to hide in the basements. But you can see all around here, you've got a kind of valley coming through down here. And you've got, higher ground all around. So there's higher ground here, higher ground. And then around this sort of mountainous area, high ground too. This is almost like a plateau on top there with high ground around here. And then it goes down to the river. And so it's quite difficult for the Russians to take this area because they have to, come down across a river and then up a mountain. So they need to kind of take it from this angle. But, same sort of issue going that way. So this is quite good area for the Ukrainians to hold. There has been pressure at different times of the Russians coming in this direction and getting into the sort of edges. There's this filtration plant or whatever this is over here that has been under Russian control and Ukrainian control, and now it's kind of a bit of both, bit contested. Haven't heard any news about that recently. And then as you can see here, this is a kind of quarry area that is somewhat deeper there. So there's a very interesting topography in that area, but it just makes it very difficult for either side really to progress, particularly the Russians to move to the west. This is why you've got this whole kind of almost salient just sticking out there like a sore thumb, because the Russians are just very difficult for them to take due to the physical geography. Rivers, forests, mountains, quarries, valleys. It's tough. Anyway, not that anything's happened there. I just thought I'd have a little chat about that. Okay, moving on to Bakhmut. I'm now going to go and dip into Kenneth Gregg, the Finnish fighter who's now doing charity work in Ukraine, says, at the moment, preparations are underway for a final push before the autumn rains and the harsh cold of winter, although I hear that weather is looking pretty good going forward for the next few weeks, or certainly week or so. So that's good news. The aim is to get through the massive Russian defense line at Zaporizhia and then use roads during the winter. Up at Bakhmut, we are also pushing to cut the road to Bakhmut and take the last ridges around the town. Then it's just a matter of sitting and watching the Russians during the winter and letting the lack of food, ammunition and winter clothing take its toll. At the same time, our service lines to our guard battalions work without problems. War is not only a question of resources, but also of good maintenance roads. When we cut it, Russians will have autumn and winter problems. There's something to be said about this, because Russians are in another country, and it's a bit different to the Ukrainians. Ukrainians can service all of this area quite easily because it's their country, right? And there's going to be no hindrance to them doing anything. But there's possible saboteur activity in the occupied regions. You've got it's not Russian, so they have to get things in from Russia, and logistics just becomes more difficult. And then when you've got Storm Shadows and HIMARS hammering those logistics in a way, yes, the Russians are giving the Ukrainians a hard time, and they are using the FAB 500 bombs and whatnot. But I think that the Ukrainians are doing a much better job at slamming Russian logistics, and it just means that the winter time will be, I think, a little bit more difficult for the Russians than it will be for the Ukrainians. And in fact, just generally doing war in this area, when you're in someone else's country, it is just more difficult than for the Russians than it is for the Ukrainians. Anyway, at Kherson, something's also being prepared, probably the establishment of several bridgeheads across before the rains arrive. Many have now begun to say that our great offensive should have taken place around Bakhmut. What Andrew Perpetua was saying last night, actually. Remember that our success there was due to the withdrawal of the Wagners and the fact that the Russians invested resources in Kupiansk, Andriivka, and Zaporizhia. I wonder if he means Avdiivka. If we would have gathered large troops at Bakhmut, the Russians would have reacted faster to troop movements. Probably correct. So anyway, he goes on to talk about his other stuff there. And I'm going to pop into Rebuy here to see what they have to say. Pro-Russian sources on the southern flank of Bakhmut's defense, fierce fighting continues in Klishchivka. Despite the statements of the Ukrainian side, most of the village continues to remain in the grey zone. There are some claims that maybe the Russians controls some of the houses, the very northern edge of Klishchivka, but I think it's probably somewhat unrealistic what Rebar's saying here, although they are trying to retake the land. I don't think there's any doubt about that. General Syrskyi said this yesterday, that there has been a breakthrough in the Russian defences. He's a bit vague about that, but also that the Russians are trying very hard to retake the land that they have lost, and that will be Klishchivka. Quite why they want to do that, I don't know. The whole place is absolutely... I mean, you saw Bilarivka. Now, this has not got updated imagery, but if this was updated imagery, you would just see... it's flattened. I mean, you look at some of the drone footage of Klishchivka, and it's just, as Perpetua was saying last night, you can't tell where one house starts and the other ends. It's just they're all completely flattened. The place has no intrinsic strategic value. It only has strategic value or tactical value in acting as a buffer, right? So it's like in and of itself, no, but it just stops you getting to the next line of defense, right? But you can say that about literally anywhere in the world. If I fight here, then it means that I'm not fighting over here. Okay, when I'm fighting here, yeah, it's good because it means I'm not fighting over here. So, whatever. I think this barrier here of the railway line is far more important. Klishchivka, you want to dig in there and soak up the pressure from the Ukrainian attacks. Trying to retake Klishchivka. Exactly the discussion I was having in yesterday's video, I think it was, where they were discussing in an article, is it from the Kyiv Independent, where you had Michael Kaufman talking and others about the two different approaches to the Russians doing wars. Surovikin would have them sitting back and defending, whereas Gerasimov is much more of an active defense and going out and counterattacking. But that's just attritional. You're just going to lose your troops in Klishchivka for no discernible gain. So if they are attacking in these places, then I don't think it's particularly sensible. Andrew Perpetua did say that he wasn't sure about this section of land here, that Suriyat Maps has actually drawn the Russian line further back recently, and Perpetua said, yeah, it could well be. He just doesn't know, but it could well be not in Russian control, because I was wondering about that myself. Anyway, that's the situation around there. Not too much detail. We go to the ISW. There's exactly what I've been talking about. Nothing too much to add there. Right, let's move on to look at a couple of sources concerning actually this area of the front line. So this is a Russian source. So Russian forces near Bakhmut are completely falling apart, is the claim. Russian mill blogger Philolog, the Saroy zone. sounds like his cat just died. This is really revealing, right? The situation, this is a Russian source, the situation at the Klishchiivka-Kurdyumivka line in the Andriivka area is very difficult. It is very heavy, mainly not because the enemy, in principle, managed to push through our defenses in this sector. The key problem is the hysterical response actions that our command is taking in this area. So this goes back to what I was just kind of talking about. Like, we must retake this, let's hysterically go and attack it, and these counterattacks. In addition to their actual advancement on the ground, the enemy worked out the situation with Andriivka well in the media field. As a result, we have hysterical attempts to recapture the ruins of Andriivka. Equally hysterical attempts to counterattack are taking place in the surrounding areas, so Klishchiivka and Andriivka. Intelligence support and planning of counterattack actions are frankly weak. The detachments of the allocated forces and means do not correspond to the assigned tasks. The arriving reserve units are not introduced into the situation and receive conflicting information. There is no proper artillery support for the actions of the assault groups. Taking advantage of superior firepower in this sector and in general in unmanned aerial reconnaissance and adjustment systems, the enemy inflicts effective fire damage on our counterattack units, quite easily lures our assault groups into firebags, and our infantry suffers heavy and unjustified losses. I mean, this is about as damning as you can get it. And this is music to the pro-Ukrainians' ears. Like, when I read this, like, it's absolutely terrible for the Russians. And their claims are that it is terrible. And they're only getting away with not completely capitulating because they are forcing their troops into these counterattacks and just feeding troops into this consistent grinder. As far as I can work out. Anyway, I mean, this is the umpteenth version of this that I've read. You know, the umpteenth complaint along the same lines here, but I've read you a similar one from Dnipro River, from areas around Zaporizhia. Anyway, ill-conceived and unsupported counterattacks, again, exactly what I was talking about, are fraught with the depletion of available resources and available reserves. The collapse of defenses at adjacent heights and the enemy taking the Gorlivka-Bakhmut rockade under fire control with the probable subsequent interception of this rockade. I don't know quite what that last bit means, but it is not good for the Russians here. And this is why it leads people like Andrew Perpetua, for example, to say that this would be, and you kind of heard this from Kenneth Gregg, this would be the best place to do a large-scale counterattack. Partly because the Russians have been on the attack for so long that the defenses won't be as well built up as they are elsewhere down in the south. However, there are trench lines behind the lines. There's also the kind of question of topography around here. So the Ukrainians actually have quite a bit of height advantage in a sense around here. So if you come along, the problem is the railway line here, to the east of the railway line is a kind of river that's quite sort of boggy and marshy, and that has crossings in certain places. You can see them here and here, just there, I think, and again probably there. But it's quite difficult to get across here. So this is another natural barrier for the as a challenge for the Ukrainians. But they have the high ground above Klishchiivka, and if they can use that, and over here as well, if they can use that to get, you know, artillery and range and whatnot to take this, where the ground goes up here. So what is this? It's about 167 meters, 162, 145, 150. So 168 meters is the highest I've seen it there. It's already higher just here. And then when you go up there, that's 200 meters. So this is the Ukrainians have the higher ground. If they then take this, that will then give them higher ground over this subsequent dip in the territory here, and it's, you know, movement around the south of Bakhmut. So there is some good opportunity for the Ukrainians to make hay while the sun shines there. But it's whether the Russians have got a lot of resources behind in Bakhmut. They still have the resources there because they were so worried about losing it. Anyway, we'll move on. Not too much to say about Avdiivka, apart from the Russians are desperately trying to counterattack north of Opitny and try and drive the Ukrainians out of the positions that the Ukrainians took. You remember when there was all those claims about Opitny falling and there being fighting on the way to Donetsk airport? Well, that was all rather overblown. I think the Russians did lose a lot, and they did end up hitting their own forces with artillery, but the Ukrainians never seriously took Opitny, as far as I can work out. But they did succeed in taking some really well dug in positions to the north of there, and the Russians are trying to get them out of there. And then really as you come past Mariinka and some of these other places, there's not an awful lot of news. Vuhledar was hit by aviation, I think, but not too much news. And then Velika Novosilka, not a lot going on there either. Now, we'll pop in and do a couple of threads by Tatragami, so I think it might be useful. We're going to start with Klishchiivka and Andriivka, as we've just been there, and then we're going to move on to the Robotin axis before I visit that on my map. So just a short thread here I thought might be worthwhile going through. With our forces achieving success in Klishchiivka and Andriivka, a new natural front line has emerged along the railroad, effectively separating the opposing sides. In this brief thread, I'll elaborate on the importance of this phase and provide additional context. So remember, that's exactly the land I was talking about. You've got the railroad along here, and then this marshy river there, and then it raises slightly higher there, but it's not as high as on the western side. So as evident in the image created by Defmon, the current front line aligns closely with the railroad, flanked by tree lines on both sides, followed by open fields. The altitude image shows that controlling Andriivka opens up crucial avenues for further advances in the east, south, and north. However, it remains essential to cross the railroad, which the Russians use as an obstacle, and focus their defensive efforts there. So here you can see the high ground around here, but there is high ground further to the south of Kurdyamivka, which might be really, this area will be the next challenge for the Ukrainians, the next objective. In this satellite image, you can see that lakes and forests can provide cover for Russian forces, while open fields present challenges. Hence, crossing the railroad and establishing a bridgehead can become an important but challenging task. The success of Ukrainian forces in Klishchiivka, Andriivka, and the Kurdyamivka area may lead the enemy to prioritize the defense of the railroad line. Russians may counterattack to seize Andriivka and Klishchiivka if their command opts to deploy reinforcements for that. And that's what was being talked about. So they're a little bit more meat on the bones there. Whether they dig in or whether they try and counterattack, I guess we'll see. I mean, the claims are that they've already been breached along that railroad line anyway. Anyway, to go on now to, past Velika Novosilka, just not a lot of information coming out from there. And actually no mapping changes to the Robotina area. There is lots to view in terms of video imagery coming out of this area, and shelling. Might not be that the Ukrainians are as far down here. Andrew Perpetua is talking about, like, unsure of, which side is doing what in this area, but it's certainly contested near there. Rebar says of this area near Orikhiv, the Ukrainian commanders pulled together significant forces to break through the Russian defences at this site. Nevertheless, new attacks south of Robotina and near Verbove ended in the usual way for the Ukrainians: losses and retreat. So that's what he is claiming there. And the Tatragami thread here. So a brief thread on the Prokopivka, Robotina, Verbove area updates. So through a comparative analysis of images captured on September the 18th and those taken nearly 2 weeks ago, the landscape changes confirm the combat area and direction of current advances by the Ukrainian army. And this is exactly what Andrew Perpetua does. Observing the emergence of new scorch marks, signs of shelling, and the defoliation of tree lines provides a rough estimate of combat engagements and active fire exchange areas. This aligns closely with the map provided by Defmon. Again, similar sort of stuff. So this is the area, if you remember, of the manned trenches where the Ukrainians have increased their control going down south in a southerly direction, and then in an easterly direction towards Verbove. That's one of the key areas, and the other key area might well be down here, alongside, sort of parallel with Prokopivka. The question is how far the Ukrainians have got with regard to these trenches there. Okay, if you can see my cursor, if you listen to this, these trenches there means nothing to you. This is a reference map that can be used independently to verify the data. Not all changes are marked, especially those discussed in the previous thread about Prokopivka. Today's map primarily focuses on eastern and northeastern parts of Prokopivka. So basically, if you look at this map, you can see that that tree line there, right, that line, I presume, should be green in the same way that this line over here is green. You see that there, that is green, and that's because there's no front line there at the moment. No one's shelling that. But here, that suggests that one side or the other has been trying to advance up or across that tree line, and that is why it's been absolutely hammered. The same can be said for that. The same can be said around here. But these shelling areas indicate areas of intense fighting, and that helps you to determine where each force is. Okay, so going on to the next one. Using elevation maps and satellite imagery, it's evident that Ukrainian forces are approaching Russian defensive positions, including anti-tank trenches and Dragon's Teeth. Breaching these positions would be significant, though whether this area becomes the main focus remains unclear. So that is, okay, what he's talking about is this area here. Exactly what I was saying, that I'm not quite sure, or Andrew Perpetua saying not quite sure exactly where the Ukrainians and Russians are. Now, this imagery might well be 2018 imagery, so the colours of the fields will be different to things that the Sentinel imagery will show you, which will be, you know, as it is now. So the kind of alignment of those fields, and sometimes they actually change field positions entirely. You know, in 5 years, like we're going to knock through that tree line to turn this into one bigger field. So even like the dimensions of the fields can change. So as you can see, it's quite different trying to work out from a 2018 map where the Russians and the Ukrainians are now is somewhat challenging. But anyway, that's the area we're talking about, where there's a lot of intense fighting going on. And as you can see from, so here you got Prokopivka. So we're going to keep pretty much parallel with that to show you on this height map there. So you've got the height coming along there from the roads that stick out on the left of the map there. You've got high ground and zigzagging across that that line there. So it's here along here. So this is where your heights are. And this appears to be where there's quite a lot of intense fighting going on for that Hill 166. Anyway, a little bit more on that, but not too much information coming out of there other than, you know, it's still intense fighting. I mean, you can go to the ISW and find out about, you know, who's repelling whom and whatnot, but it's basically unmoved, just intense activity. Now, the last thing I'm going to go to is on Suryat maps, which is here. There's just one more mapping change that they have, which is the Datchet area near the Antonivsky Bridge. The recent Russian bombardment over the small settlement of Datchet allowed Suryat maps to correct the front line in which the Ukrainian army controls the positions a little further to the south. Not a huge difference, but I don't think it signifies anything particularly happening either in the last 24 hours, but it's just a rejig of their mapping to accept that the Ukrainians are further to the south along this area, along the road here. I mean, I'm amazed that they're still there at all, because they are just getting hammered by aviation here, by the FAB 500s, and they don't seem to be moving forward. I don't know, it's just too difficult for them to do so. You've only got one road, so that's good. If the Russians have fire control over that road, then you're in trouble here, because trying to advance any other way, either on foot or with mechanized equipment, is going to be particularly difficult, and they're not going to have much mechanized equipment. So it's actually really difficult for the Ukrainians to make any gains around here. You know, you're going to have to walk or do it at night, but you know, just particularly difficult. And that's, I guess, why they need to get as many footholds on the left bank of the river as physically possible, so that they can try and exploit one of those areas or several of them and keep the Russians thinking on their toes. Right, that's today's update for you. Not a great amount of news, but a little bit of information about the topography of these certain areas. Hopefully that's useful for you. Please like, subscribe and share. Thank you so much for watching. Take care and speak soon.